All
Hey.
right, there we go.
Um, so, you know, this research, what I was going to ask you first is, um, what motivated you to do this research, and what was the context of the other research we discussed too? How is it different?
So the other one is a much more specific paper on the usage of trade credit, right? So I think I told you before in that paper, the unique angle is that supply chain is a chain. It's not just two firms. It's not just bilateral relationship. There's more than two firms on the supply chain. So in that paper, we're trying to show, for the affected firm, they actually have a stabilizer effect where, everybody along the supply chain going to come together and help to maintain the stability of the supply chain.
Right. And so,
And
oh, go ahead. Sorry, go
and
ahead.
that in that paper, the key thing there is trade credit, right? So trade
Right,
credit, what stabilizes the supply chain.
right.
Yes.
But what was the motivation for this research? And was there anything specific motivating you about it?
Yes. So this one, this is actually more, I think topical in light of what's going on in the world these days.
Yeah.
Because if you look it up, nobody can tell you what's the supply chain risk any firm is facing. There's
Yeah.
no such measures available. If you just look it up, there are people who have, oh, we have a measure for political uncertainty or for environmental risk, this and that, right? And nobody can tell you, hey, what's the supply chain risk firms are facing.
Yeah.
So, and also it's very difficult to quantify supply chain risk because, there's concerns because supply chains are very complex. Let me give you an example. So for example, if you are my customer and you might be facing some bottleneck because your other suppliers cannot deliver, right? So you are making, say, laptops and you need keyboard and a CPU. So you cannot get your keyboard from the other supplier and I'm supplying you CPU, which means you cannot, now this is all just in time inventory, right? So everybody has to have everything ready to start putting the pieces together.
Hmm.
So when you're constrained because of somebody else's constraint, and I don't know that as your other supplier, so which means that's why we have this, everybody's in a scramble when COVID happened and nobody can see, hey, where's the bottleneck?
Right.
What's causing this? Because this is way beyond like just
Right.
congestion in ports and stuff like that, right?
Right.
Because transportation is a very small part of the supply chain.
Right. Yeah, because I mean, it's like people can't see the forest for the trees with the supply chain. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's what I'm putting it.
So one question, so I'll start with my questions too, my other questions. So how would you characterize this proxy you've developed for supply chain risk? And I know you mentioned it's a first, and that more papers tend to like explore shock transmission, and I get that. So characterize your proxy and why it's cool.
So this proxy, it's actually coming from through text analysis and some machine learning by
Mm-hmm.
looking at firms' earnings transcripts. So firms make earnings call,
Yes, absolutely. Yeah,
quarterly
I read them.
report. So we go back to all the way back to 2002. It's not a COVID paper. It's actually this applies all the years we have data for.
Right.
Yeah, and because what the company is trying to communicate with their investors or with the analysts, that's what they will tell you what's going on in
Right.
the supply chain. Because in the earnings call, there's also a section called Q&A, right? So our analysts will ask questions and the
Right.
CEOs will answer, and that's more spontaneous compared to say we go look for some company filings or some kind of press release because they have to think on the fly. There's nothing that's written by the lawyers, basically, right?
Right. No, I understand.
Yeah, yeah. So we can
Completely.
actually see what the firms discuss in terms of supply chain. That's why we think our measure is cool because we can actually just go, our earnings call transcript has multiple pages. We can just go in there and directly go to the language that relates to supply chain. I will tell you the method in a little bit, like using our supply chain dictionary and to see whether those are related to risk and uncertainty that's associated with supply chain, right? So by quantify that, and for every single report, we can get some kind of metric in terms of how much is exposure to supply chain. and we aggregate it to the firm level and the firm year level, so we can see, so what's your supply chain risk look like over the course of 20 years.
Yeah. You mean at the individual firm level or in aggregate?
So we actually can see at the individual firm level, yes.
Oh, and where's that data or that finding?
So for every single earnings call transcript, we can actually assign the score. What's the supply chain uncertainty associated with each transcript, right? Firms do about 4 transcripts a year.
Yes.
Corresponding to the 4 quarters, and we basically take the average across the 4 quarters, so we get a measure for each year.
Okay. And where do you have that in a table or a chart, or where's that reference, just out of curiosity? Or is that just where you draw from, you know what I'm saying?
So yeah, so our data is at the firm level, right?
Right.
So in the paper, like figure 2, that just plots the average across all the firms every year. So
Yeah.
that's the aggregate, because we cannot show what each firm is. There are thousands of firms in the data, right? So you show them firm by firm, but eventually our plan is to make the data public and put it on our website so people can download and see, hey, what's Apple's supply chain risk over the course of 20 years? We can look into this.
Yeah. Oh, God.
If you have any specific example you want to have in your writing,
just
a list of companies. I'm happy to see what it looks like, if they are interested enough to put in there.
Yeah, definitely, because I can think of a few, and I'll follow up with you what would be really relevant given, sort of the landscape, right? And I get what your bigrams are and all that stuff, so we don't have to go into the weeds with that, but that's cool. That's really cool. So you quantify the supply chain risk a firm is exposed to via management statements on earnings call. That's one. And then and obviously you see that during the pandemic, obviously this discussion of supply chain dramatically increases. I mean, it's off the charts, know.
Yep.
And that manufacturing industries are most sensitive to supply chain risks, sort of like in 2019. You mentioned textiles, machinery, high-tech minerals, and then especially semiconductors, which is, all in the news a lot, and there's a lot of policy and things like that addressing this issue. So your research is really, really timely. It's really cool. So let me find this question. So is your well, I'll get into the weeds. These are my final questions. So one of your findings was that large firms, because they have more complex supply chains, are exposed to supply chain risk. Can you kind of discuss that finding a bit?
Yes, so you're referring to table 8. So that's where basically that's more like a summary kind of table, give a big picture of what kind of firm characteristics will show up when we have associated with higher supply chain risk. And in terms of your specific question, because of the firm size, think about Apple, right? They have so many different suppliers, thousands of suppliers,
right?
Which means one link goes wrong, everything's gonna go wrong. And that's why we think which the data shows, higher firms are definitely correlated. Larger firms are definitely correlated with higher supply chain risk.
Yeah, because there's just so many more moving parts.
Yeah, think about, so I ordered a car last year, so it has to sit in the port in Galveston for about 3 months because they're missing the cameras.
Oh, that makes sense.
You see, right? It's a car, there's lots of parts put together, but you're missing that one tiny thing.
Oh my gosh. That's then the other finding that sort of was a key finding was that supply chain risk increases for smaller firms, where there's like geographic distance that they have to, that adds a risk element. And so firms address this by increasing investment or multi-sourcing, in other words, diversifying. Can you kind of discuss some of that?
Yes. So So we are basically saying here is, so in terms of, I don't know if we have the results on smaller firms, but we do have the results on, so if they're geographically farther away. So this also goes back to table 8.
Okay.
We're basically interpreting every single coefficient in that regression table. So for example, when you talk about different continents, right? So these are what also shows up in the news. If you have cup suppliers that are farther away, like in Asia, right? China is in lockdown still pretty much. And you just have trouble getting the production to ramp up there, and you will have trouble sourcing your inputs. So that's where we think geographically, if they're farther away, and we do see these kind of results.
And do you think this issue of, is there like a firm size that tends to reshore more given this geographically induced supply chain risk?
So yeah, so what's interesting, that's a good point, because so I told you earlier, so larger firms have more complex supply chains and they have more supply chain risk. But if their relative size over their suppliers are much bigger, which means I'm Apple and you're just the guy who's making the button, right, which is a tiny company somewhere in China or Taiwan or somewhere Southeast Asia. And if they have a massively, much bigger compared to their supplier, that's what we call this relative size. That means the company have less concerns about their supply chain because they can basically have much more bargaining power to dominate or just dictate the terms.
Right. Yeah. So that would indicate that smaller firms would tend to reshore as opposed to larger firms that have the clout. So maybe you're seeing, I wonder if it's more like small cap and medium cap that might have to consider moving back to home base, so to speak, rather than like an Apple or a big multinational firm.
So what we actually showed, what's interesting about our paper, another really the thing that we like a lot as authors is we not only develop a measure, right? So by having a measure at the first come up with the measure, and most measure papers will tell you, okay, that's our measure, which is very cool. But we don't stop there. We also tell you what's economics behind the measure and what firms do in response to their heightened supply chain risk. And you see in our the second half of the paper, which is what we like the most, I think, we actually show all the firms are actually flying to safety. So everybody's going back to the US or going back to suppliers that are industry leaders who are basically more reliable, right? So in that sense, firms are actually planning what we should do to deal with the supply chain bottleneck.
Right. That is the big punchline of your paper, is that with this uncertainty, there's a flight to quality, which means reshoring, whatever that means within the firm context. And that it increases reliability, which is also similar to the concept of increasing resiliency, supply chain resiliency. And that's it seems like that's what the pandemic exposed, right? I mean, and
the firms go as far as go buy their upstream suppliers. You hear this in the news all the time, right? Like Tesla is going to go buy a chip manufacturing so that they don't have any shortages on the cars they're making. Actually, we do show that in our paper, that firms go buy their suppliers or sometimes buy their customers, just make sure that they control the entire supply chain.
So if you're a smaller player, it's a good time for you because you could get bought and you could be done with it and have a payday.
Exactly. So this is actually this is something we're working in progress, because we think this firms go buy their suppliers has effects that more than what we're thinking. Because think about it, if I go buy my supplier, this not only ensures I have a good production process, ample supply of my inputs, it also creates a bottleneck to my competitors.
Yes.
That's something we're working in progress for a new paper. But
that's very smart. Very cool. Oh, wow. So And also in your paper, back to this idea of geographic proximity and industry leaders, the flight to quality. So this M&A behavior tended to also fall, aside from the pandemic, which was like the giant black swan event. The Japan earthquake and the Thai floods also inspired this kind of behavior, the M&A behavior. And so it's like you said, it's event driven, right?
Yeah, so because the reason why we did all those usually for it's academic research, we want to make sure it's airtight, and also because one thing we worry is we don't want everything people say, oh, it's driven by COVID, right? Because COVID is very special, a lot of things going on,
Right.
So we actually run everything again just without the last year or two, and you'll find the same result, even just without looking at COVID at all. That's firms have been doing with their supply chain. Because they realize. So this goes back to the whole concept of the just-in-time inventory that's starting in the 80s and got really big in early 2000s in the accounting, right? People are just really, and in supply chain, they're really just pushing that. We keep zero inventory to keep our costs down, and so we can, have higher profit. But the firm starts to realize that's not gonna work after. So the Japan and Thai natural disaster is one example where that's actually a pretty big shock to a lot of firms in a certain region, because Japan and Thai are actually specialized in a lot of inputs, and we actually see that after that, then firms are starting to be more vigilant about their supply chain, how they manage their supply chain risk.
Yeah, well, that gets at a really interesting point, because what you're showing is, okay, the Japan earthquake and the Thai flood, both of those were in Asia, where a lot of these smaller suppliers to all these types of firms are. And so that's going to send a certain amount of M&A in different places, whether it's Europe or, the US. But the pandemic was widespread shock, right? And it's across the board, and you still see it, it's the same behavior, but it's a bigger event, obviously.
Yes.
But it's, I see.
Because the reason we cannot just study the pandemic is, like you said, it's a systematic or system-wide shock. Everybody gets affected. We don't know, because for Japan and Thai, which is nice because it can help us to basically just focus on that, right? When we hit that region, then we study what happens to firm with suppliers in that region.
Right.
But with COVID, everyone's hit. Who is more hit, who is less, we don't know.
Right. And then, like you said, certain industries get hit more just because the nature of their business has, more supply chain tentacles, if you will. It's like
yes, that's definitely true. Yes.
Okay, so you're the first to show that supply chain risk is a driver of this vertical integration. Have we covered that, or is there anything else to say about that? You mentioned that your paper is kind of a first to show that this supply chain risk is a driver of vertical integration.
Yes, we are, and we are the ones to actually first to quantify such risk.
Right. And that, again, back to this question. So that's at the firm level, you said?
Yes, firm level.
Okay. Okay, so these are two last kind of questions where you may have to like make a leap or two. So would you consider your research to be more forward-looking? You know what I'm saying?
Interesting question. No. I think so.
Yeah,
it's from archival data, right? And we see the patterns, but it also tells us something that's been happening to supply chains, how firms think about their supply chain.
Yeah.
The last 20 years, and I think that firms are going to continue thinking about supply chain the same way going forward.
Yeah, right. It's strategic, right? They're thinking, you're capturing the strategic thinking of these players, you know.
Yes.
And and within that, inherent in that is, you know, you do talk about the ability of suppliers to meet demand, right? You know, key point. And then, you know, that it's not just the supply chain risk is not just whether the port of LA is functioning, which was something the media picks up on, or that transportation costs are exploding and we have inflation and we're paying 10% more for food and all this stuff. You know, there are all those effects.
Yes.
But really, yeah, yours, and those are just tactical things related to supply chain issues, whereas yours is strategic, you know, and therefore to me that says it's forward looking.
Yes. So what you are for, like some transportation, this and that, you can see those, right? You can look it up. What the transportation index, I believe, that we also use as a validation, and those are tangible stuff you can measure. What I was, because our measure goes much deeper than that. Like I said at the beginning, I can see whether you're, by looking at the transcripts, we can kind of get a sense. The machine will tell us, hey, whether your other supplier is having trouble, which makes you put you into trouble, and then I'll be in trouble too, because I cannot deliver my goods to you because you cannot start your final assembly.
Yeah. So are you saying that your research shows on a granular level? I was up at 4 this morning. That how it connects to one firm, that your research has level of granularity?
Yes, right. Because all the index, the transportation index or whatever, it's at the country level, right? Something like that. Or if you look at so earlier days, there's like, for example, those index on say political uncertainty, this and that, all at the country level. And now they are making firm level measures as well. But like we are basically just getting right into, hey, what's the supply chain uncertainty at each firm? Right? That's very granular. We can see what's wrong with your supply chain.
Right. Wow. That's really cool.
I like that.
Yeah, I looked at a couple of your firms at the end of the paper, where you kind of give the examples of some of the bigram, you know, what you pull out of earnings calls. And I looked at a couple of those tickers, you know, just to see, you know, just to look at some dates, you know, and that was kind of interesting, and to maybe try to work out, okay, was this affecting their profitability, you know, different things. So I kind of like just took a peek under the hood just to, you know, make some connections. Not that I really made any like tangible connections, but I'm working on it.
Right. Well, let me know if I can help with it in any way.
Yeah, well, thank you. So here's one other question. So given your findings, and this is kind of a final question, given your findings, what are your recommendations to firms about reducing supply chain risk? What would you say to firms, you know, given what you've learned in your paper?
So we came up with a few things, right? This we have talked about briefly. So there are flying to safety, and because it's at the end of the day the trade-off, right? You want to have a reasonably resilient supply chain. That's gonna have a cost associated with it, right? Buying your supplier is not cheap. And having something made here in Texas versus in China is probably very costly different, right? Vastly different in cost.
Right.
So for firms, it's a trade-off, and given the big political environment, I think firms are probably thinking towards moving stuff back, right? You see this new bill passed in weeks ago about this semiconductor industry, right?
I saw that. There's a lot of money going to that industry. I noticed too. Yeah.
I think this actually dealing with not just supply chain. This is much more complicated because there's also geopolitical risk in China and Taiwan. Just basically the US is worried if China shuts down all the chip export and what we're gonna do, right? So that's another reason, but also for supply chain reasons, if we can ramp up production here, then that will resolve a lot of issues. Because every machine these days have lots of chips in it, more than people are thinking of.
Yeah. I mean, it was just something that we just took for granted, the semiconductors, the chips, all that. Yeah, there's a lot in that Inflation Reduction Act, and I've looked at the numbers, as it relates to energy and the things that I work on specifically. But yeah, and actually the semiconductor amount, I don't have it in front of me, it's actually, I think it's the largest single chunk of change, that the government's putting out. So well, I think that's it for me. I mean, is there anything that you would like to add that we haven't?
So one thing I'm pointing out is in our figure 1, this word cloud, which we are actually quite proud of. So we basically have machine go through every single transcript and try to put them into topics, right? And so for each earnings call transcript, we have a machine say, okay, what are the big umbrellas on the big umbrella topics, and put those into, and we see, the firms are discussing like because of supply chain risk, then we have uncertainty, we have like demand issues with our R&D, and the firm also talk about we're doing acquisitions and stuff like that. So actually, so that's something we're really actually very proud of, is firms are not just we're thinking out of the in the stay in the ivory tower making things up, but firms do discuss the issues and what we find in terms of the actual actions, in terms of fight to safety and the mergers. We see those in the actual data after we have our measurement.
Yeah, you mentioned your machine, your magic machine. Is it like a AI type machine, or is it a machine learning type machine, or the same? Or I mean,
so it's a machine learning, right? So we use the machine learning. So it's computer go read everything and look for pattern, and then probably
Yeah. So where did you get this machine?
Okay, so it's a program. We just run it on our computers.
Oh, okay.
So we write a lot of code, and it does.
Oh, okay. Did you develop it, or was it already existing off the shelf?
So for a lot of the so somebody developed it, but we have to modify for what we need, right? So in computer science, they're way more advanced than us. So we're not using like probably not the most cutting edge, because that's what they're still working on. But we use something that's really robust and be proven to be working.
Yeah.
Have that machine to read all the transcripts.
Yeah.
Are you? Yeah, go ahead.
Is it a certain software program that?
So there's a package. I mean, you can deploy this in multiple different programs. So a different software language you can use. So what we use is it's called the topical modeling. So let me check. I don't want to give you the wrong hold on, the wrong name for it. So it's called, where did it go? Topic modeling analysis.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
It's fascinating, because I'm always wondering, how AI and machine learning are being applied in different ways. Because you read about it, and it's not something I follow.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting to see its applications.
Because how you apply it's like a black box, right? You don't know what the machine's doing in the background, but so we just feed the program our input, and it will spit out the output. And what's going on behind the screen, we don't actually. We have to we know what's going on, but it's difficult to observe that process, I guess.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting.
So just to help you navigate through the paper better. So the paper is structured in a few ways, right? So first we start with what we do. I mean, that's motivation. Then we talk about our measure, how we construct it, all the diagram and stuff, and then we basically the validation part, maybe something your readers are not interested in so much. Then it comes to the implications. I think that's what's more important.
Right. Yeah. Well, brilliant. Well, thanks so much. I'm going to stop the recording, but we can. Oops.